Anyone who's ever worked in a factory or a factory-like setting knows that they tend to be kind of rough places. They tend to be inhabited primarily by males who tend to think that they're still in a locker room. And so the language is coarse and often rough, and, it's not a very friendly place to women. In fact, it can be almost downright hostile. It was an unlikely place for this friendship to develop, but it was one that developed, interestingly enough, on the floor of AC Delco. Two women who worked on the line who formed a friendship. Florence and Liz developed a friendship because Liz said, I could tell that Florence was a Christian almost from the beginning, just the way she acted and talked. And I really love that imagery, that somehow you could just tell by the way she acted, by the way she talked to others, that she was a Christian. No outward show, no soapbox, just the way she acted and talked. And I found that very interesting. It's a story I heard actually this past week. I generally look at the Sunday scriptures this Sunday for next Sunday. So I think about it all week long. And on Monday, I went to the funeral of Florence Day. Some of you know Bonnie Gainey. It was her mother. And so I went to the funeral, and the deacon walked in and came up to me as we were waiting in the gathering area at the church where the funeral was going to take place. He said, my mother knew Florence. They worked together at AC Delco. And then he related how Liz formed this friendship that lasted years, not just on the floor of AC Delco, but years afterwards. That they continued to go out for lunch after they retired, and there were lots of phone calls back and forth, encouraging one another, supporting one another in family difficulties and along the way. But it all started with, you could tell she was a Christian by the way she talked and the way she acted. And I kept thinking about that and what Jesus is saying to us this weekend. He says, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven unless your holiness, your righteousness, surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. And you have to look and say, okay, now remember, this is Matthew's gospel, and Matthew is writing to a Palestinian Christian community that is in conflict with Pharisees and scribes, and so that comes through loud and clear, especially in Matthew. But especially among some of the scribes and Pharisees, it was all about keeping the rules. What are the commandments of God? All 613 of them. What are they? And we need to keep those. And somehow, holiness was just about keeping rules. It wasn't about the way we live, the way we act. Jesus says, no. You have to be better than just being a rule keeper. You have to be more than that. And so he says, you've heard it said to your ancestors, you shall not kill. But I say to you that when you assault another in the way you talk or in the way you act, that you diminish their life. And you're liable to judgment just as the killer is liable to judgment. Not that it's the same thing, but that we're called to be better than that. We're called to treat people with respect, whether we're seeing them face to face and talking to them, or we're talking about them to another. We're called to be respectful of others. He said, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you start thinking about it and planning, you've already kind of committed that in your mind. As a confessor, I have to tell you that there are lots of adults who say, well, I have thoughts. And I got to tell you, he wasn't talking about just casual thoughts. The first commandment that God gave us is be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And then God said, to make sure that happens, I'm going to give people thoughts. That'll bring them out of the caves to look for each other, it's not just the passing thoughts, it's about planning. It's somehow, engaging in the kind of thought pattern that diminishes another human being to an object of my pleasure, not about treating them as a human being made in the divine image. He said, you've heard it said, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. But I say to you, just be honest with people. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Really? Just be honest. Not in a brutal sort of way, but to be honest with one another so that we trust one another when another says something to us. What Jesus says again and again is, you can be better than that. It's not just about keeping rules. It's about being better than that. He calls us to a higher level of living in this world so that the Florences and the Lizes of this world would recognize us as Christians by the way we live and by the way we talk. I love that story about those two and the friendship that developed out of that. In a difficult place, two Christians found one another, supported one another, encouraged one another in a friendship that lasted for years and years. The question that I ask myself that I'll leave with you is, if Liz or Florence were to meet us, would they recognize us as a Christian by the way we talk or by the way we act? Not just sometimes, but most of the time, if not all of the time. Would they recognize us